We're fortunate this morning to have panelists who are seasoned practitioners who can share their experiences and perspectives from a range of organizations, from NGOs and donors to different types of private sector actors to financial institutions that either lend to or invest in the cocoa sector. And while three of the panelists are based in Ghana, that's not by chance, because Ghana, I think, really represents the state of the art, of the cutting edge in terms of landscape approaches in the cocoa sector. We have three other panelists that work at the global level, and so can either present on and or discuss their experiences that go beyond Ghana and West Africa. The goal of the session really is to be as participatory and interactive as possible, and so we're using a format that's innovative, at least new to me. The idea is that the panelists will each be asked to make brief initial presentations of approximately 5 to 6 minutes each, highlighting opportunities and challenges from their perspective, and really trying to inform the subsequent discussions that we'll have. Where they're going to have, after they finish, we'll have a brief session for Q&A where attendees can share via the chat function questions. I'd ask you to keep those questions short and directed to one of the panelists. I'll try to cover those questions within the limited time, if possible. And then we're going to break into three separate groups. Unfortunately, you don't have a choice in where you're going to be, where you go. You're going to be allocated automatically by the organizers. But we'll have two panelists in each group. One of the panelists will serve as the moderator, and the other will be a note taker and rapporteur. The breakout sessions will be 20 minutes each, and there we're going to get into much more detail. There'll be Rebecca and Victoria will be in one, representing the perspectives of the NGOs and donors, pretty focusing more on technical issues around landscape engagement. Then we'll have Pamela and Jeff representing the private sector, giving their perspectives, and then finally we'll have Kun and Paul representing the private sector, the financial sector's perspective. During those sessions, the attendees in those sessions can raise their virtual hands in the chat function, and then will be called upon by the moderator, and then they'll be asked to unmute themselves and ask questions and have a dialogue. That goes for 20 minutes. Then we'll come back into a plenary session. Each of the three groups will have 5 minutes to report back on the highlights of the discussions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, going back to the chat function, and I'll again try to field the questions. We're tight on time, and so I'm going to ask the panelists to stick to the time limits, and if you're not wrapping up by about 5 minutes, I'm going to give you a gentle reminder that you need to do so pretty quickly. So just so you know, the main plenary sessions are recorded, and you'll be able to access those recordings afterwards, but the breakout groups are not recorded, so you may want to take notes in those sessions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Rebecca, who will head us off. Over to you, Rebecca.
Rebecca, I think you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
Geez, what a start. Yes, I am muted. Thank you, Sophia. I'm Rebecca Sari at Nature Conservation Research Center. It's great to be here, and I'm excited that this is a topic and we're talking about it. So, Sophia, can you put up my few slides? You can go forward. Next one. So what I wanted to share with you is based on about 20 years of experience from my institution here in Ghana, implementing landscape approaches. And if we want to think about what's the opportunity or what's the challenge of a landscape approach, I would frame it as the reality. No matter how you frame it, you cannot tackle issues like deforestation or many other critical issues, including child labor, including farmer livelihoods, including biodiversity, unless you take a landscape approach. And this is because supply chain interventions, while very well-meaning, they cannot tackle the majority of the issues at the farm or farmer scale, because you don't address off-farm natural resources via a supply chain. you can't address the negative social actions that are being driven by the broader social or institutional happenings in that landscape. You need to take the whole landscape to be able to comprehensively really understand and change what's going on. So if you look at this schematic, this theory of a landscape, my point here is that if we have a series of communities that are black dots, we have cocoa being produced, other tree crops, and cutting across it, we have a forest reserve and a big river. Even if your supply chain, let's say, is focused on the east or southeast of this landscape and is doing very laudable work, the reality is that the farms and communities to your northeast are encroaching into the forest, and the farmers and communities to the west are driving with illegal logging. You can see these little chainsaw icons. And so if you want to protect this forest, you need to actually be working across the landscape comprehensively. Next slide. And so the question of what does it take to achieve a landscape scale? Well, how do you get to scale? The first piece we argue emphatically is that you have to have nested community-based landscape governance. You need landowners, you need land users, you need the natural resource users to be at the center of driving the change in how forest resources are used, in how climate smart or cocoa agroforestry is scaled out and adopted, and in monitoring on the ground. And so this schematic just shows the idea of how different levels of governance bodies can have jurisdictions where they're monitoring and implementing and taking action, and then nested together at the top with the overarching landscape board. You can, next slide. What you also need is you need partnerships. In Ghana, we call it a consortium. And so in these consortiums, you have NGOs, you have private sector, you have government agencies that are all working or investing in a landscape and have come together in a pre-competitive partnership. Quarterly meetings, cost sharing, and then planning together. And so it's not a siloed effort, it becomes a concerted effort of everyone working towards common goals in that landscape. And the next slide. And then you need a strong monitoring system. So if you want to know, if you're doing all of this, you want to know if you're having an impact, and you want to know if there's something new coming up that you hadn't sort of been aware of, right? We've been working with Lint, the Lint Cocoa Foundation, to develop a M&E system to monitor cocoa landscapes from the perspective of sustainable production, ecosystem health, well-being and social inclusion, and landscape governance. The intent here is to be able to tell us what's happening in our landscape, but we also want it to align to other key initiatives. So Ghana's Cocoa and Forest Red Plus program, the monitoring that will happen there, CFI commitments and targets, as well as to landscape standards like land scale. So as you're implementing together, you're also putting in place a monitoring system together. And then the second to last slide. I think the final piece that's essential at that landscape level is to have a sustainable landscape, it needs to be sustainably funded. You need to have the resources for these governance structures to carry forward. And the model that we are using in Khartoum and have used in other landscapes with Shia is putting together trust funds based upon where your investments are based upon premium payments from botanical supply chains. And so we're using the combo nut, which is out of a local forest tree that's very, very common in the cocoa system. Farmers are harvesting it. They can dry it right alongside their cocoa. They're being paid the same price as their cocoa beans. And then just under 30% of the value of that combo nut as a premium is being invested into a trust fund for the CREMA, for the community landscape level governance body, with the intent that they will be able to cover their recurrent costs going forward over time. So from my standpoint and experience, these are the key pieces you need to take it forward. On the last slide, just a pitch to say that we've tried to capture this learning with support from World Cocoa Foundation, P4F, Victoria's organization, and also IUCN Netherlands into a learning document with a toolbox of resources. And just on the 27th of this month, we'll be officially launching, and that will be available. So please be in touch if you're interested. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and appreciate you keeping to time. So without further ado, we'll now ask on Victoria to present.
Thank you, Frank. Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Dia. I'm the Regional Director for Partnerships for Forests for West and Central Africa. I'm extremely excited to participate in this session today to discuss this very important subject matter of scaling sustainable investment for cocoa landscapes. We at Partnerships for Forests have been supporting in scaling pilots and creating opportunities and investment for catalyzing investment for sustainable land use and forestry to bring in equitable benefits for people, communities, the private sector, and the public sector. Slide 2, please. In terms of our approach, Partnership for Forests is an 8-year UK government-funded program aimed at creating market-ready partnerships that offer an attractive balance of risks and benefits for all, whilst protecting forests and building resilient communities. Our focus in West and Central Africa has been around arresting the drivers of deforestation built on major commodities, and this includes cocoa. As you're all aware, cocoa is an extremely important economic commodity, with 70% coming out of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to the global market, and also 15 to 20% accounting for gross domestic product in both countries. Interestingly enough, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, over 3 million smallholders whose livelihood depend on cocoa farming income fall way below the daily poverty line of $2. We are at a tipping point, and we must pivot to deliver on commitment to salvage the remaining forests. As recently as 2018, about 3.6 million hectares of forest was lost, and this is equivalent to the size of Belgium. However, it's not all bleak. We are transitioning. Recognition of challenges and demand, challenges related to the demand and supply for sustainable commodities, moving the industry to act to reduce deforestation and degradation and strengthen the sustainable supply base of cocoa, as we can see from the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. This is what Partnership for Forests we are positioned to support. We support to create market-ready forest partnerships, strengthen the demand for sustainable commodities, and create the enabling conditions for sustainable production and the protection and regeneration of forests. Slide 4, please. Slide 4. Yeah, great. In terms of, slide 4, in terms of opportunities, next slide. Yeah, brilliant. In terms of opportunities and innovations based on our experience from P4F, we think that it's absolutely critical to build on partnerships. Rebecca just spoke about that, to create the unique opportunity for impact. So under the CFI, we see huge momentum and commitment from the industry and government in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to succeed, with plans underway to replicate the CFI in Cameroon and beyond. Similarly, from the oil palm sector under the TFA, Africa Palm Oil Initiative, which spans across 10 countries, we see collaboration or cooperation from government and industry. And even more recently, with the ambitious targets set under the UK-led COP26 Nature campaign, create the opportunities for collaboration, dialogue, and participation. The second point I want to make here is that based on pilots from P4F, there are some evidence-based tested models that can be replicated and scaled around sustainable landscapes. We see that from the Olam Rainforest Alliance project in Ghana. There are a few examples from the Tuton example, which had NCRC, Rebecca Asari, playing a very instrumental role in there. And from Samoa, And these opportunities exist to share the lessons around how communities and the private sector can collaborate to keep the forest standing whilst building sustainable supply chains. Slide 5. Great. In terms of our vision for driving impact at scale, we see it in, I see it in three levels actually. So one is at the landscape level, so continued creation and replication of forest partnerships and creating the enabling conditions around that within a pre-competitive space for collective actions to unlock greater investment and sustainability. These should include robust monitoring and reporting systems, and these are what we've been building in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. At the next level, which is at the national, regional, and global level, it's important to institutionalize and mainstream nature-based solutions and sustainability conditionalities into policy and practice, while strengthening the demand for sustainable commodities. At the third level, that is on financing, I think that blended financing is the way to go. So using grants to de-risk investment, whilst creating the platform and the opportunity for greater to unlock greater investment for scaling business models. In terms of financing, what we're doing currently in P4 for the West and Central Africa region is that we are exploring setting up sustainable landscape level finance mechanisms in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Essentially, these are to address the challenges of upscaling and mobilizing financing for pre-competitive deforestation-free results at the landscape level. These are all in very early stages. So there are two projects. One is the sustainable finance mechanism in Cote d'Ivoire. The other is the finance mechanism in Ghana, but we are at the feasibility and design stage. And the plan is to explore whether we can set up a special purpose vehicle or a landscape manager to essentially convene collective action for sustainable environmental and social benefits. There was a question around who do we think should lead in these landscape efforts? And for me, I think that partnerships and collective action is the way to go. Depending on the context and the political economy and the strength, then you determine who should lead the partnership in that regard. So I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Frank.
Thanks very much, Victoria. You're making my life easier. I appreciate that. We'll now turn to Pamela.
Hi, I'm Pamela Schreier. I'm the Global Manager for Sustainability in Cocoa for Ecom. But as some of you might know, in addition to cocoa, Ecom is a well-known player in the coffee sector. So today I'm going to share some lessons learned about our experience with landscape programs in coffee, specifically in Central America and Asia, and what we found is needed to scale kind of from a different perspective. So firstly, we found that there's not a one-size-fits-all landscape approach, but it's important in all of the approaches we've tried to clearly define each actor's role from the beginning. So as Ecom, we kind of have two roles. The first is as a commercial partner, and in coffee, this has kind of taken two different shapes. One is to promote or create market demand for specialty or regional certified coffee produced within the landscape and sold, and look for ways to create a market for added value for that coffee. And then the second kind of role we play in the commercial space is if there is a brand or roaster also involved in the landscape initiative, the role is more logistics, how to guarantee the price to the farmer, traceability, pre-harvest financing if that's needed. And then the second role that Ecom can play is through our field staff or SMS staff. We play a key role in promoting the adoption of the on-the-farm activity aspects of the landscape, including climate-smart agriculture, like efficient irrigation systems, propagation and distribution of improved planting material. In the case of coffee, this could be a resistance to disease like La Roya or drought for Central America, and then promotion of appropriate agroforestry systems based on different studies we've worked on. The second thing we've learned is that we found that it's imperative to develop landscape programs within a favorable political context. So this could be national initiatives, but it's also further enhanced if there's regional or local governments that have prioritized landscape restoration. Because of their proximity and heightened interest in local change, their participation is fundamental for the landscape to for actual success to happen and for it to be embedded in kind of a local context. And then finally, we found that in addition to alignment between public and private sectors, and I think this is probably obvious, but there's a key role for other institutions, academic institutions and NGOs, as well as international cooperation to scale the landscape beyond the supply chain. These entities provide valuable expertise, financing, and also can play a convening role to help link the landscape to kind of a wider audience, which could be other industries as off-takers for the agroforestry systems, the other products produced in agroforestry systems, or other industries investing in the landscape. In Central America, we've seen the tourism, ecotourism being promoted, and that being a valuable partner in any sort of coffee landscape. So I'm short and sweet there for Frank, but we can discuss further in a breakout group.
Well, thanks. And because you did such a good time on being short, I'm going to just ask you one clarifying question. No
Okay.
good deed goes unpunished. When you look at coffee and you compare it to cocoa, is there anything inherently different about cocoa from your perspective? Or is it more of the same? Or is there some special challenge that you see?
A lot of the issues faced are the same. I think in the experiences we have, the context is slightly different based on government priorities around coffee in those regions, and the governance structure in general. But in terms of the crop, we haven't found too many differences.
Okay, great. That's encouraging. Thank you. So now over to Jeff.
Hello, my name is Jeff Mensah. I'm the operations lead for Mondelez International's Cocoa Life program. I would like to take off from where Rebecca left off on the partnerships. So generally, that's the way to go. There needs to be partnership formation among the public, the private, and the people in order to address some issues like financing gap, technical knowledge, and things like that. But I would like to nail it down to partnerships within the private sector. So there's great opportunity for the private sector companies to come together and operate at a pre-competitive level and ensure that the financing gap is well bridged. That is to spread the burden of financing landscape work among themselves, and to also ensure that there's knowledge exchange, and lastly, to build interest. And that's where the point is. So where do we start off? Do we engage the partners in between the process? For example, at the point of developing
Looks like we're having a technical problem there. We'll give Jeff a few seconds to see if he can reconnect. If he doesn't reconnect, we'll probably ask Kun from FMO to step in and present, and then we'll have Jeff come back if we can. Let's give him a few seconds more. Everyone else in Ghana is okay, right? So it's not a Ghana thing, it's a Jeff thing. Okay, all right. All right, so I think given that this seems to be a technical problem, Kun, would you mind, or is Jeff back? Jeff, you're back. You're back.
I'm back. Okay.
Keep going. I'll give you 30 seconds extra for technical challenges.
All right. Thank you. So I guess I went off when I was mentioning the benefit for coming together. So for the Sunafo Certificate landscape, the companies, 8 of us, including Mondelez International, have come together. We've made and continue to make decisions together and agree on them. We are also contributing funds for implementation of the activities within the landscape. And there are some unexpected benefits. So a team that has been commissioned by Forestry Commission, that's the regulator, to develop the landscape management and investment plan, has now been charged to develop a national framework for landscape management and investment. So this wasn't in existence, but by the fact that companies are together and going together, this has resulted out of it. And nailing it to the companies, we also realize that the other the people, the communities, have to also be engaged at the right time in order to help them understand their role and how they benefit from any landscape engagement, because they are critical stakeholders within the landscape. And in most of the time, they are brought on board quite late. And when it happens like that, their aspirations, their objectives are not always aligned with the bigger group. So when they are brought on board, they are also able to position themselves to support the process. They might not come with fiscal cash, but their in-kind support will go a long way to reduce the financial burden on the partners. And on this, there is an interesting experience from Cocoa Life where we supported farmers to plant 1.4 million shade trees. What happened? We didn't start off giving them the shade trees, but we trained them to understand the economic and ecological benefits of shade trees. Then what happened? They came in to request for the shade trees. Now they've planted it. It's because they know what they will get out of it. That's how come they've come for it. And if they don't understand the benefits, I know some organizations are really struggling around the scope. And most organizations have come to us to help them understand how we did it. And it's because the communities were engaged earlier, and continuous engagement has yielded that. In addition to this, we have a CRIMA set up within the landscape with a long-term vision of going into landscape work. This CRIMA has been there and operating and functioning. And we have this fire brigade squad attached to the CRIMA. So they are ready to support the landscape work being undertaken within the within the Sunafo Certificate landscape. Maybe the question to ask is that, so who should initiate such engagement? Is it the public? Is it the private? Is it the communities? Because it takes some time and it needs some money. On challenges, I mentioned they need to go together, and it also goes with being slow, and that could be a disincentive in itself. So how do we mitigate that? In the Sunafo Certificate landscape, what we did was to appoint a convener. So this convener will liaise with World Cocoa Foundation, WCF, so that we are only giving aggregated information. We are not supposed to be following up on reporting, on reports made by consultants, but rather we would always want to hear from the convener and support the convener to validate these reports. It takes quite some work from us, and it speeds the work as well. However, we have not been as fast as we should have been. So what measures should be put in place to mitigate such slow movements? Maybe it's a question for us to think about. Just to mention a critical driver, as a cocoa manufacturer, product manufacturer, we know that most consumers would want to also see the ingredients for their products coming from sustainable materials. And this is growing, and it's becoming critical for companies to also listen to these consumers, because they are critical in the supply chain. And this is pushing companies to show some interest in undertaking landscape work. There are also emerging national trade laws and policies, and this would eventually put pressure on companies to initiate such efforts. Let me lastly mention communication as well. So companies want to be ethical. Companies want to be to communicate exactly what they do, how ethical the company is, and such initiatives will go a long way for the company to write all that they are doing to the bigger community. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks very much. And obviously in the breakout session, it would be fascinating to hear more from your perspective about how you can collaborate in a pretty competitive way with other companies. We're getting a little bit tight on time, so straight over to Koen, who can give us the perspective from FMO, and then to Paul.
Thanks, Frank. So my name is Koen Vergenderen, Investment Officer at FMO, responsible for our agri investments in Southern and West Africa. As such, also responsible for our cocoa investments in the region. For the ones that are not familiar with FMO, 30 seconds about our organization. We're a Dutch development bank. We have a portfolio of roughly 11 billion euros invested in debt and equity across emerging and developing countries, private sector only. We focus on 3 sectors: financial institutions, renewable energy, and food and agri. And we have quite a large cocoa portfolio. We're involved in a couple of value chain managers, origin processes, the confectionery. We have a MFI focusing on cocoa, as well as an agroforestry project combining cocoa with teak, so quite a versatile portfolio. So whereas we do know a bit about cocoa, the whole landscape approach, I have to admit, is still quite new to FMO. We have, let me call it, flirted with landscapes a couple of times with projects in the past, which contain some landscaping elements. But it's only now that we're actually really starting to look at landscaping approaches. So why is this changing? So we have a commitment to the 1.5 degree pathway, which requires us to invest in projects with negative carbon emissions, offsetting our positive emissions. In addition, I guess it's also a realization that it takes more than isolated projects to make difference at scale. And I think this especially goes for large-scale land-based agri projects, where often the challenges faced are just too difficult to tackle for a company on its own. In addition, on a more broader level, we're seeing increased attention for the effects of deforestation and climate change. Definitely at NGOs and government level, but also increasingly at the consumer level, who are pushing the industry to become more involved as well. Examples of these include the likes of Unilever, but also Mondelez, who contributing capital to funds focusing on tackling these issues. But also our own Dutch government has made funds available. And as such, there is currently, or at least in my personal opinion, quite a lot of affordable blended finance available, or funds available to invest in landscapes. If you look at over the past 2 years, funds focusing on these sectors have popped up everywhere. The likes of DFCD, N-Green, FarmFit, Agri3 all have a landscaping focus. And FMO is involved or working with almost all of these funds. So how do we make, so we have to make sure that the large flow of affordable capital is actually directed towards landscapes. However, a couple of challenges remain, obviously. So we see sometimes challenges with the jurisdictional, the regulatory framework, where there are issues with land rights or the enforcement of environmental policies, which are limiting or preventing some of these funds to invest in certain countries, which also include some of the main cocoa growing countries, which is a pity, of course. More broadly speaking, the environmental, social, but also reputational risks associated with large-scale land-based projects, including a landscape cocoa approach, definitely remain and might deter some DFIs as well as institutional investors. Definitely a relevant factor to consider from my point of view. In addition, it is sometimes difficult to get enough skin in the game from the industry. We have seen a lot of examples where the industry is more than willing to buy beans, pay a premium, offer some technical assistance as well, but actually putting in equity and taking ownership is a different story. And then lastly, most of the sustainable cocoa initiatives that we've seen have been quite limited, quite small in terms of volume, and often in niche origins like the Philippines or Nicaragua. So the question is whether you can actually take these and do it on a large scale with large volumes in mainstream markets like Ivory Coast and Ghana as well, and whether parties are willing to pay the additional premiums there as well. And maybe an even more interesting question is whether the introduction of the living income differential, which is already making Ghanaian and Ivorian beans substantially more expensive than other origins, is making this even more difficult. However, to overcome these challenges and ensure that we can fill all these funds that are available with great landscaping projects, we feel a couple of the things are important. So we feel that a large role of the private sector is crucial. Take a leading role in these projects, put in equity as well, and drive efficiencies. Also, share success stories and best practices. We find it interesting also to look at a combination of the timber industry and cocoa. We actually have a nice example of this in Nicaragua, where a client of us is investing, combining teak with cocoa, both at a plantation level as well as with smallholders. And finally, and this is a little bit outside of control of the cocoa industry, but it would be great if the market would acknowledge that there is actually a cost towards carbon emissions, and projects with negative emissions would get compensated via premiums from positive emitters, such as carbon credits. So then to finish up, so who should be running with this? Well, if you ask me, it definitely should not be the financial sector, because if we look at FMO's portfolio and we look at projects where DFIs or other banks have taken a leading role, a lot of these projects often fail. And we might pride ourselves in being the entrepreneurial development bank. We remain bankers and not entrepreneurs. So whereas obviously the easy answer is it should be a joint approach of all actors, also the ones gathered at the table today, which I fully concur with. I do want to stress that we feel a large role of the private sector is crucial. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Koen. And so Paul, over to you. Paul, I hope we can leave a few minutes at the end for some clarifying questions. So Paul, take it away.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hello to everyone. My name is Paul Ramirez. I am Project Origination and Investment Officer of Mirova Natural Capital in Latin America. Just a brief explanation of what is Mirova Natural Capital. Mirova is a platform basically dedicated to allow finance flowing into conservation activities at scale, and basically design, innovative products to allow capital to flow to conservation activities through a series of fund products with a large set of investors from public sector like MFIs, DFIs, and private sector of banks, insurers, and family offices. For example, FMO was one of the first investors in our first climate fund, the Altilia Climate Fund. So, and what we look as a platform is we're looking for big impact and a fair market return over the investments that we made. We started working since 2012-13 with the first fund with around $100 million. As of 2020, we have assets under management of around $600 million under management between 6 funds that we currently manage, between our own funds and funds that we manage for others. And basically our goal is that by 2022 we have at least 1 billion euros in the under management, in this natural capital market. Basically how we are investing and maybe an example of how we are investing right now is we look for projects that actually tackle adaptation and mitigation over climate change, restore degraded lands through agroforestry systems a lot, in buffer zones of natural protected areas, with native communities, and basically also through equity and loan structures. We can do both. We can do a mix of both. We work a lot through red projects now because we use the carbon credits as collateral to our investment. So basically, we gave a loan to the NGO or the company that developed the project, and we get the carbon credits as collateral. We sell the carbon credits, and with the sale of the carbon credits, basically we repay the debt. So and when there is some kind of profit sharing, basically most of the profit sharing goes against to the field activities. So basically, we look for very strong impacts in our portfolio, in terms of reducing deforestation, in terms of CO2 mitigation, in terms of generating jobs, in terms of protect biodiversity, in terms of creating new companies. For example, one of our flagship projects based in Latin America is a red project in a protected area, that is the Tambopata National Reserve in Peru. Now we protect around 350,000 hectares of pristine forest inside the protected area, but outside, that is the most important, we have restored more than 1,000 hectares with agroforestry systems. And the agroforestry systems include, cocoa, more than 1,000 trees of cocoa per hectare. We have timber species, and we have also short-term species like banana, beans, things like, in order to generate to the farmers incomes in the short term, the first 2-3 years that actually the cocoa is growing and start production. Then the cocoa from the year 4 until year 15. And then for the long term, like we say, like for the retirement of the farmer, the timber species that could generate them incomes also. So that is the kind of approach we are looking. We have replicate that model in several projects across Latin America, like Peru, Guatemala. In Colombia, we are looking for a project. Also, we have invested in Brazil. We have done very few investments in Africa, but if the conditions are there, we are able to look for it. Now, mainly the biggest challenge that we have faced in that is that, for example, looking for the right partner, a consolidated NGO with experience managing funds, or with field experience to deploy this kind of investment, because we are not talking about 200,000 grants. We are talking about millions of dollars of investments. We are talking also, having de-risking mechanisms. For example, for our investment right now, for one of our funds we manage, the Untitled Climate Fund, we have a very important de-risking mechanism with USAID that granted 50% of our investments.
Paul, just sorry to cut you off, but we're getting out of time, and I had said we'd have time for some clarifying questions in this session, but I think in the interest of having enough time in the breakout groups, we're going to go straight to the breakout groups. Magically, you'll be assigned for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back, and if you've got burning questions for panelists, we'll just keep those either for the breakout sessions or when we come back into plenary. So Sophia and others, if you could just switch into the breakout groups, that'd be wonderful. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We had a rather sudden ending to our session. I hope others had a smoother transition, but anyhow, we're back. And, you know, we don't have a lot of time as always. So I'm just going to ask the rapporteur from the first session dealing with the NGO and donor perspective. And I believe, I'm not sure, is that Rebecca or Victoria, to please lead us off. 5 minutes to hit the high points, please.
Victoria.
Okay, thanks, Victoria.
Okay, so yeah, we had a bit of an interesting start. We had questions from the main session since we had to just go quickly into the breakout group. So there was a question around when we talk about partnerships for landscape program, there isn't much emphasis on government, on involving government. So we had a whole conversation around that government is really important for one, mainstreaming solutions from the landscape level into policy and practice, but also for creating the monitoring system, safeguards. And we spoke a bit about some experiences from Ghana on projects that Rebecca is working on, and also that P4F is funding. Then there was another question around which was brought into perspective, experiences from Cameroon, where you have landscapes that are, you have diverse, multiple commodities. So in that case, how do you have a landscape program in place, especially as today the conversation has been around cocoa. So we spoke about that, and I think that the feedback here is that you need to have a phased approach. I mean, landscape, very complex. You have multiple smallholders working on oil palm, rubber. You actually even sometimes have galamsey mining. So you need to start from somewhere and start small. So you start with cocoa, you make sure that you have the consortium in place, you have the governance systems in place, and people are fully comfortable before you start expanding to bring in other commodities. There was a third point around monitoring systems and the need to have GIS, remote sensing technology in place, have baselines, set indicators. Is very important for landscape programs. And I think that on top of that, having a national forest monitoring system that has the credibility, right, to provide a report that would be objective is also important. So we spoke about that. We had someone from intelligence in our group who shared her experience in some work that she had been doing in Ghana. Let me stop here and ask whether anybody from our group has something to add.
I think Andre made a great comment. We were asking about, you can learn lessons from success, but I'm interested also in what doesn't work and how can we learn so we don't all have to make the same mistakes. And he was pointing out an experience in Cameroon where it's very challenging when you have extensive forest that needs to be protected. And there's a good initiative to initiate a landscape approach towards forest protection. If it wants to include cocoa as a commodity, but it's not a hotspot for production, it can be really tough to sort of jumpstart the corporate or the supply chain interest. So he was discussing a little bit about, it's almost the paradox. If you don't have enough threat, you don't have enough cocoa, then it's not interesting. But then, go forward in some years, the threat may have increased. You may have lost quite a bit of that forest. Then people want to get on board. So then how to overcome that challenge. I think you're muted, Frank.
Sorry, I was saying, were there any other major points there? Or is that, if not, we'll move on to the next group.
I think that there was also a question about management planning or land use plans, and just the point of you need all stakeholders integrated and working on it, but you need to be careful not to put that plan to the landscape and the communities. Actually, they also need to be deeply involved in its development.
Okay, great.
owning it.
Thank you. So we'll move into the next group, and then we'll try to keep the comments short to the really sort of the major points that came up, or the most interesting points from your perspective, because we want to have some time at the end. Okay, so over to the next group. Is that, I should know, is it Pamela?
I think it's me. So kind of jumping off Rebecca's comment on the Cameroon example, we had a conversation about how it's difficult to prioritize investments in regions with little cocoa, because as the industry needs to kind of balance commercial as well as social and environmental priorities. So it becomes kind of a difficult ask, because the most obvious business case is kind of increased productivity where the grower and buyer will benefit, but then there's other conditions that you have to think about. We also had a larger conversation about considerations for an industry to invest. Kind of different experiences say that there needs to be systems in place that create security around the investment. So for example, in Ghana, if the investment's in shade trees, then there also has to be a system in place for tree registration, because that's the only way you can kind of ensure the benefit to farmers at the end. Also, another consideration is that while many companies are already recognizing their growing responsibility in the supply chain, there's also kind of pending the due diligence legislation that in the EU, for example, will kind of push even those companies who have not fully recognized their responsibility to go to that. So that's another consideration for industries, and maybe will be impetus for more investment. Also, the other big point we talked about, that while we were focused kind of on private sector investment, it really needs to go hand in hand with public sector investment, especially if you're thinking about diversifying income and not just relying on cocoa in the landscape, but how can other markets be developed outside of commodity products? And that was seen as kind of the public sector could play a big role in that area. Did I miss anything else, Jeff?
You captured all the important points. Just to add that it was made clear during the discussions that it's never a focus on environment. It's rather productivity. That should be the driver for investments, and environmental investments will come along.
Thanks very much. Yep, sorry. Thanks very much. We'll now turn to Paul to summarize the third group discussion.
Thank you. So basically, we start from two statements. The first one is it only possible to finance cocoa landscape with blended finance? And the second one is, there is plenty of funding available for cocoa landscape. So basically, we start from that, and what we have is, for example, on the comments of the panel of the team, is that it's important, to have blended finance in early stage of the project. Depends of the stage of the project, could be very important, because could work you could decrease the risk, basically. If, for example, you start from a project that it's already in production and scalable, it will be different. It won't be that important, but we start from the parties. It's important for early stage projects. Then we have found in the group, we have discussed that there is a lot of money available for sustainable efforts, in the cocoa sector, but in practice, it's very complicated to access. We find that there is a big bridge between, a nice project, a nice pilot project, and an investable project that could also meet, the sustainable requirements and the impact requirements from, from private investors, or for large scale investors like us. That has made that it's very complicated to commit, long-term efforts of this investment for this kind of investments. We also discussed, what is the bottleneck that we have found to invest in this kind of project, and what the members say that it's a lot related for investors. The threat is that there is a reputational risk, because probably there is not enough transparency in the sector or in the supply chain. We need 100% of traceability. What also was commented in the panel is that there is this medium-term vision in the investments, and that we need to change that for a long-term appetite of investment. That the business terms have to be adjusted to this long-term vision that they said. What also we hear in the discussion is that it's very difficult to have multi-stake partners and to operate, these public and private investment when you have different actors and different sources of money, that you have different requirements, and it's quite complicated also to put all these people in the same table at the same time. One of the things that we also mentioned is that the industry don't feel comfortable working with governments. So that's something that, and that the industry is moving faster than the investors. They mentioned that, that the cocoa sector in the last couple of years, have disclosed a lot of transparency in their supply chain, and that the investors, they don't know, maybe that investors don't know about this, but the investors are at least a couple of years behind them. So that could be, I think, the main things I take note. Maybe if I miss something, my teams are welcome to compliment. You are on mute.
Thierry, keep trying.
And again, Frank.
How's that? Am I back? Good. So thanks very much, Paul. And Kun, if you want to add anything else, or anyone else from that panel has a burning point they'd like to make, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll switch now to Q&A. I'd ask you to make your questions succinct if you can in the chat function, and ideally to direct them to a specific panelist. And I'll read those out. And just so you know, while we're technically supposed to end in 7 minutes, we get a 10-minute extension for those that would like to stay on. I don't know if you heard me. So now, if people would like to submit questions, just send chats and I'll be able to read them out. Okay, in the absence of questions, I'm going to ask each panelist, if you have one takeaway or one recommendation to the group, what would it be? And Rebecca, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
I think, well, I'll give you two takeaways. One is because I'm coming from the NGO sector, and because our bread and butter is working with communities, I think you can't underestimate the importance of really deeply engaging with the farming communities on the ground. And I think that's a fundamental key to success. It's perhaps not understood always by the private sector, but you don't have to own that. You just have to partner it. And you have to find the right partners who do know how to do that. And NGOs are also great partners with government. So I think that also leads to, we've kind of been dancing around the issue of who should lead a landscape approach in a consortium. And I think everyone has a very vital key role. But quite honestly, from my experience, you need a neutral party. You need an honest broker that can be trusted. And so there needs to be, generally speaking, I would say that's more of an NGO type role, because they need to be able to work with everyone across that partnership and with the communities to organize, to plan, to convene, to set up how decision-making will happen. So I will fly that little flag of, I think, bringing together the work. You got to start with a strong NGO that knows the landscape. And then you build in one or two companies and then you go from there.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that. And I still don't see any questions. So if the organizers have questions, please send them to the chat so I can read them out. But if not, then Victoria, what about you? What would you cite as key points or key takeaways, or if you could wave a magic wand, what would you wish for?
Thanks, Frank. So, I mean, listening to the other panelists and from my breakout group session, it was quite interesting to hear that everyone did seem to think that partnerships was the way to go for landscape programs, so public-private partnerships. And there's still some uncertainty around which of those stakeholders should lead at the landscape level. Rebecca has made the point about civil society, but then at the landscape, we are not only looking at social and environmental, there's also commercial interest in the landscape. So for me, I have a slightly different view. I think that you need to have like a blend. So public, right, which is the NGO, civil society, who would do what they do best around, okay, social enterprises and also working with communities. And then you have the private sector also delivering a specific role around services for deforestation-free results. So this is not the supply chain services, it looks beyond that. So pre-competitive services around deforestation, but linked to cocoa or to whatever commodities within that landscape. So you need that mixture, that blend.
Okay, thanks very much. You know, I'm still not seeing any questions from the audience, so please don't be timid. You know, send your brief questions in the chat and I'll be happy to read them out. Okay,
Can I say something a little controversial, Frank?
Yeah, go for it. And then I've got one question coming in from, so you go ahead and then I'll ask the question. We'll go to the other panelists.
So just to be controversial, or maybe it's not controversial, but I think our interesting experience from the Khakum landscape is that our partnership started from really long conversations that built trust and understanding that led to contracts. So we talk about blended investment. We brought donor funding already to the landscape, and then Hershey came and partnered us and is investing into both landscape governance and their supply chain through ecom. And then Hershey brought in Lint, and Lint is investing through Olam. What's been very interesting to me is that trust was built through a series of conversations amongst women. So I've had the same conversations with men who are in leading roles in companies, but to be very frank, where I see the really innovative partnerships being built in that Khakum landscape, there's consistently women at the helm. So, you know, are women more apt?
I want to applaud.
That's very interesting.
Okay. More women. We need more women. I've got
I like the gender spin, Rebecca.
I've got two questions. One is a statement which I'd like someone on the panel to react to. It's a statement saying, I believe that the partnerships require multidisciplinary skills, including operational management. So that's one question that panelists can choose to respond to. The second question for the panelists is it realistic to think that mainstream finance can adopt conditionality that reflects the best practice in cocoa industry reforms that characterize the industry of late, such as agroforestry, traceability, deforestation free? Let's have a response to those two questions from anyone on the panel that would care to respond. And then we'll come back to the panelists if we don't have any other questions.
Okay, I would like to talk about the first point on skills and operational management. I side with the, I'm on the side of the statement because if you look at the partnership at the top level I mean the public, private, and the people partnership, all of these groups come with different skills, and these skills are needed. If you look at the private sector and the public sector, especially the regulator, would come with set of skills to help with knowledge and as well as governance, the policies and things like that. Now at the private sector, we work with the communities mainly, and these communities, the mobilization skills required, the facilitation skills, the training, the private sector has that skill. And then we have the communities themselves. So it cannot be one skill set, it has to be multiple, and that would drive the expected outcome that we want to see. So that's a true statement. On specifically on operational management. So when these parties come together, then they have to also look at how to operationalize the consortium. Otherwise, nothing happens. It's not just a matter of coming together, but you have to find ways and means to make sure that things happen. And going back to the experience we have with the Sunafo landscape, because we've selected a convener, things are pretty much going on. And that's one thing that is needed in such a group. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other panelists that strongly disagree or feel the need to opine on that statement, or should we switch and go to the, if so, please say so. If not, let's go to the second question that's been posed. I think everyone can read it, no? But if you can't, I mean, who would like to respond to that?
I'm happy to take that, Frank, and I think it's a good question, and I do think that this ideally this should be the case. I also think that if you look at mainstream finance, you have to distinguish, I think, a number of financial parties. I think DFIs for sure. I feel DFIs should definitely look at this and adapt to certain conditionality. From FMO's point of view, I can say that we will not be investing in cocoa companies unless they look at the issues in the supply chain, unless they work on a traceable supply chain, on deforestation free. That doesn't mean that it has to be 100% traceable by the moment we get in, because we see our involvement as growing, helping companies to get from the point where they are, and that should be at a level that is acceptable. There are things that we cannot accept, to a level that we feel as a good level or an ideal level. Whereas you should be realistic, of course, on the standards that you impose on a local Ivorian processes compared to Cargill, for example, and the time that you allow them to get it. But definitely, I feel that should be the case. And then, yeah, whether I hope that the commercial banks will follow that as well. And definitely, we try to catalyze commercial banks into our investments as well. So if they co-invest with us, they should. But that would be great, of course. I think that might be slightly more difficult because that field is very, very wide. But I think the advice should take a leading role here, and so 100% agree.
Great. Well, perhaps to Paul, do you have a thought on that from a financial institution and investor's perspective?
Well, what I can say is that us, as you know, as fund managers and as asset managers, we look for all those like traceability, deforestation-free, agroforestry system, restoration. So that is something that is pretty much in our DNA.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think the question is really for mainstream local banks, etc., where it's not so common still, I think. All right. Any other? I see there's another statement. Would anyone like to respond to the statement about the governance and management structure in the landscape program, and how do we ensure that all parties are engaged in that? Well, perhaps I can pose this slightly differently. There was reference in some of the presentations to accelerators, and I'm just wondering how the accelerators are working. Are they dealing with these sorts of participatory governance issues, or is it really more around the commercial aspects? I'll put that to Victoria. If you can hear me, Victoria.
Yeah, hi, Frank. Repeat your question again.
My question was in response to the statement about, the importance of ensuring that the governance and management structure in landscapes programs are participatory. So my question was, in some of the presentations, some people refer to accelerators, if I understood correctly. And I wasn't clear whether the accelerators being referred to are really focusing on the commercial dimensions, or if those accelerators are also looking at the soft side of things, you know, the governance, the communication, the participation, the engagement.
Right, right. So yeah, so in P4F, we call it incubators, and the incubators are, so I mean, we have a three-pronged approach, right? So the incubators are incubating the forest partnerships, and these are built around commercial interests. So the businesses around the Tuton, the Olam, etc., with smallholders. But then for those businesses to thrive, we need to remove the critical barriers to production, and that those are the enabling conditions, and that's where the landscape governance comes into perspective here, comes into play. So we are having that blended or two-pronged approach towards the accelerator or the incubator.
Thanks very much. So we've only got about 3 minutes left, and I'm going to just make an executive decision and say, because Pamela did a great job of being the shortest presenter, I'm going to give her the chance to perhaps, you know, raise a final point, if you want to, Pamela.
I think something that's come up over and over again is that it can't be kind of pushed by only one actor. So it's important, I mean, like the panel reflects that there's a lot of different expertise reflected in the landscape to make it successful. And there's a lot of, also it's not just who's involved, but also the context in which we're working. There has to be an enabling environment that incentivizes all the players in different ways.
Thank you. That's a great way, I think, to summarize things. I think at the risk of, you know, being cut off, I just want to thank all the panelists for their preparation and their presentations, and thank all the attendees for your interest. And I hope it's been an interesting session. Again, these main sessions are recorded. So I'd ask you to unmute and give everybody a round of applause. Well done. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, WCF, for organizing it. I wish we could do it in person, but this is what we got.
Thank you, Frank.
Take care.
Thank you, Frank.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.